So I've been running for about 7 years and I've made a lot of mistakes in that time. I've since fixed those mistakes, but these are mistakes that I say all the time. The mistakes that can have a massive impact on your performance, on your recovery, and your general enjoyment of running. I'm making this video to showcase 5 of the biggest mistakes that I see. So the mistakes that I'm talking about here are, in my opinion, general rules and will apply in one form or another to everyone. But the specifics that I mentioned, like specific recommendations for dosage or whatever, will vary person by person. Do your own experiments, have your own experience, and take away what is useful. So yeah, let's go into mistake number 1. So mistake number 1 is running too fast too often. So something that used to happen to me pretty much every single day, or every single day I was running, was I'd look at my training plan, I'd see there was an easy run for the day, and I'd think, all right, I'll go slow, but then if I go faster, that's a good thing, it's a bonus. And that's just unequivocally false. These runs are meant to be ran at an easy pace, like considerably slower than your race pace. So if your marathon pace, your target marathon pace was say 7-minute miles, then you want to be doing these easy runs at like 9-minute miles, 10-minute miles, considerably slower, so that you aren't kind of putting your body under a lot of pressure. Volume is, in my opinion, and by volume I mean mileage, the best metric for success. As in, when you break it all down, it isn't about how many track sessions you've done, how much speed work you're doing, how much you're stretching, whatever. In my experience, if you just look at each runner, just look at their mileage, and that's going to be the best gauge of how fast they are. I've seen this because I've seen a lot of people who train for 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons, do loads of track work, and still get beat by ultra runners who don't even bother on the track. Yes, that's anecdotal. It's not necessarily the universal rule, but that's definitely true in my experience, and I think the science backs that volume is the best metric for success. And so how do you actually achieve high volume? You need to do low effort runs. If you do all your runs at high effort, you just can't get the mileage. Your body just doesn't have what it takes. Running fast gives more physiological benefit on a minute by minute basis if you're comparing it to sort of low effort runs. But you can't sustain that because the amount of damage it does to your body, the amount of recovery that you need after a faster run, is substantially higher than what you need for a low effort run, which doesn't really require any recovery. If you do a lot of low effort runs, then you can get substantially higher mileage. When it comes to anything in life, and this definitely applies with running, I think you should look at what the best in the sort of world are doing. So in terms of running, obviously looking at the elite runners, what are they doing? Look at their training plans and see how you can incorporate that into your work. And if you look at what they're doing, they're following a rule called 80-20.
The best way to go about getting high mileage is running 80-20. So if you want to follow the elites, that's what they're doing. According to Runner's World, 80-20 is the holy grail of running fitness. So within 80-20, 20% of your runs are going to be kind of medium to high intensity, so kind of zone 3 to zone 5. That's kind of your tempo runs, your speed work, anything that kind of gets the heart rate elevated. Whereas the other 80% is easy. So that's kind of zone 1, zone 2, or if you measure in a different way, it could be kind of low effort on a perceived effort scale of 1 to 10. So essentially just like low heart rate, very easy, a lot slower than race pace. You want to be doing 80% of runs at that pace. Although I've gave a few ideas of how you can kind of vaguely measure what easy actually is, it isn't abstract at all. It's actually very measurable. So there's a threshold called the ventilatory threshold 1, VT1, and that's basically the point when the body starts to switch from aerobic to anaerobic energy use. Obviously, you're not going straight to 100% anaerobic, but there's some switch beginning to happen. And that's the point where your body starts to increase your energy needs substantially and the wear and tear on the body starts to increase. So the goal, if you want to do easy runs, is to stay below this threshold, either right below it or far, far below it. And there's a bunch of different ways to figure out what your VT1 is, but the easiest low-tech option is to basically go out, do a 30-minute warm-up, and then run 6 minutes at max effort, just flat out on a track or a treadmill. Whatever speed you can maintain for 6 minutes, go that fast, and then do a cool down and everything. Figure out what your pace was, convert that to speed, multiply that by 0.65, and then convert that back to pace, and that's kind of basically your upper limit of low intensity. That's roughly your VT1. So you might be thinking, shit, my training plan, I'm not doing 80-20. If you're following a training plan from a reputable source like Running World or, some known coach or whatever, then you're probably already following 80-20 naturally because it's a pretty universal rule. So I wouldn't worry too much about it.
So mistake number 2, racing too often. I used to rock up to a park run every single weekend with my Vaporflies on, ready to absolutely like give it 110%, ready to get a 5k PB every weekend, beat the 10-year-olds, whatever. And I literally did. I literally went there and raced every single weekend. And eventually it got to the point where like my times were stagnating and I was just hitting the same 5k pace every single time. And the worst part is I was training for a marathon. The 5k wasn't really beneficial at all. The problem is that racing takes a massive toll on the body. So you're essentially, whatever distance you're running, you're hitting your limit for that distance, and your body needs time to recover from that because reaching your peak damages the body. It's like racing a car super fast, like it's going to damage the axles and the whatever, the exhaust. I don't know anything about cars. When you race, and I'm not just talking about racing the park run every weekend, I'm talking about the people who sign up for like every half marathon, every 10k, every 5k, 6 marathons a year, 10 marathons a year, all of that. If you're doing that, if you're racing every park run or doing every local race, or just like racing in some capacity constantly, at an endurance level, so as in events that are longer than say track stuff, you don't have time for recovery. You've got the potential of mental and physical burnout. You leave yourself vulnerable to illness. Basically, you need to decide for yourself how much you want to race, but I think looking at the pros is a good starting point. Let's say they're doing 2-3 marathons a year. You could do 2 to 4 maybe. But like, that's going to take a toll. And if your goal is to run the best, fastest possible time, if you're running 4, 5, 6 marathons a year, you're not going to be able to do that. A good length of training for a marathon is like 18 weeks. Like a good healthy chunk to like build up your endurance and build up your speed and everything. You need a large chunk of time. And if you're doing 6 marathons a year, you're not going to have 6 lots of 18 weeks to train. It's just not possible, including like 5 weeks recovery or whatever. Basically, you're going to go into each marathon undertrained and therefore not reaching potential. If your goal is to just finish 5 marathons, then fine. But if your goal is to get the best time you can in those races, then I would focus on quality over quantity in this case. In all cases, for 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons, ultras, marathons, whatever, quality over quantity. And the way to do that is to select your A, B, and C races.
So when I'm talking about A, B, and C races, I'm essentially talking about the priority of your races that you're doing. So A races are obviously the most important races. Those are the ones that your training is built around. Those are the ones that you taper for, that you're basically building to. So if you do an 18-week training plan, you might build towards an A race marathon. But within that, you might do a few races just as tune-up races, as in a little race to practice sort of racing, and just some for fun. Those would be your B and C races. So B would be like, it's quite important to my training, but it's not what I'm building for. Essentially, you need to decide for yourself what your A, B, and C races are, and just make sure that when it comes to your training, you're focusing exclusively on the A race. Do mini tapers for the B races, but don't build your training block around that. Don't do a real taper. And for C races, you might not even want to do that.
So mistake number 3 is avoiding caffeine. I regularly drink coffee. I've just finished this cup here. I drink it every single day and I feel like shit if I don't have it. But I used to actually avoid it before runs because I was scared that it would have some impact on my performance, my heart rate or something, and obviously for the laxative effect. But that's absolutely crazy. Like, think about a day where you don't have coffee if you're a coffee drinker. You feel fucking horrible, right? So why would you put yourself in a situation where you're doing some like intense exercise, but also feeling like shit because you haven't had a coffee? It makes absolutely no sense. Obviously, I'm talking here about people who drink coffee regularly. We'll come back to the people who don't drink coffee in a second. The only thing you should be worried about is the laxative effect. And like, if you're worried about that, like, it's easy, just go to the toilet before you go for a run. There's absolutely no harm to drinking coffee before a run if you are already drinking coffee and are fine doing that. In fact, the opposite's true. It's literally a legal performance enhancer. Like, there is research, there's different studies saying different things, but there's research basically saying that coffee is a performance enhancing drug, and like, would be crazy, and this is me talking, would be absolutely crazy not to use it. Caffeine makes runs feel easier by reducing the perception of effort. So it doesn't actually necessarily increase your performance, but it makes it feel like the run is easier, which makes the run easier. So if you're someone who responds well to caffeine, you could see, according to these studies, an improvement of 1 to 2%, which in a marathon is 4 minutes. So you could see, by drinking a cup of coffee before you run, you could cut 4 minutes off your marathon, potentially. That's fucking crazy. Now, I say people who drink coffee regularly because unfortunately these benefits don't apply to everyone. It applies to many people, but not everyone. Basically, there's 2 camps. There's the people who can metabolize caffeine quickly, who feel the benefits, and then there's a group of people who are slow metabolizers, who take a long time to metabolize caffeine and will have a lot of trouble. For these people, they may experience gastro discomfort, caffeine won't see any performance increase, and they might feel agitated, they might feel irritable, they might get the jitters, all of that kind of stuff. I've not met many of these people. I don't think I've ever met one of these people, but apparently they exist. You might be one of them. Basically, for me, if you're already drinking coffee, start drinking it before the run if you're not already doing that. It's a no-brainer. If you're not drinking coffee now, you'll actually probably see even more performance increases if you drink it before a run, if you're someone who can metabolize caffeine. Whether or not you can metabolize it, by the way, is not something you've got control over. That's defined genetically. And so mistake number 4 is avoiding salt and sugar. Obviously, like most people want to avoid salt, most people want to avoid sugar for health reasons. Sugar has generally been found to be bad for you in high quantities, especially added sugar, like just pure table sugar or whatever. And so it makes sense that you'd want to avoid this. But when it comes to running, it's actually a little bit different. Back in the day, I started swapping out all my energy gels for like natural homemade bars made of like dates and maple syrup and loads of random stuff, because I thought whole foods would be better. So if we're just talking about performance, as in getting food that makes you faster, then dates are not a good shout. And the thing is, even if we're talking about health, it still doesn't matter, because the way that we metabolize sugar during a run is different to how we'll metabolize sugar in general. Basically, the sugar that we consume during exercise, endurance exercise, is basically immediately consumed to supply our like immediate energy needs. So if you consume sugar while running, that's not gonna spike your blood sugar, it's not gonna give you diabetes, it's not gonna add unnecessary weight or whatever. It's gonna make you run better, and it's going to actually improve the benefits you get from running, because it's going to make your run more efficient. It's going to make you less fatigued. Whereas a date bar, you've got all these whatever antioxidants, fiber, all that stuff, but that's not what you want while you're running. You don't want fiber in your system. That's going to cause gastro problems, and the energy is going to be less available, which means it's not going to increase your performance. So health-wise, it doesn't matter basically. And performance-wise, you definitely want to go for more refined sugars, believe it or not. Let's dive into that a little bit.
So sugar is essentially like the most simple form of carbohydrate, and it's the most efficient fuel there is. And as I said earlier, when you use it during exercise, there's basically no health implications that you need to worry about, assuming that you're using it in moderation and all the rest of it. But let's assume you're taking a normal amount of fuel in during your run. You don't need to worry about health implications. Like if you do not care about performance, then you can stick to your date bars or whatever health food you're taking on your runs. But if performance is the consideration, if that's the reason that you're running this race, then you should consume sugar, 100%. And it's the same for salt as well. People think salt's bad, so they avoid it. But salt, or sodium rather, is essential for survival in general. And for runners, it's especially important. When we're taking sodium, it helps us to avoid dehydration, it helps us to retain our water, and it helps us to maintain our electrolyte balance, supports nerve function, and assists in muscle contraction. All of these things are essential for, peak performance. And when you get dehydrated, which happens if you don't consume salt, then you literally can't run fast. You slow down because your body makes you slow down. If you care about performance or you care about recovery, then you should consume ideally sugar and definitely salt on your runs. You can consume that through gels, salty food, or even homemade concoctions, which is something I'm going to do a video on myself. But essentially, simple refined sugar, sodium, that's what you need. And there are some rough guidelines. So again, everyone is individual. This is going to vary, but just as a kind of rule of thumb, you kind of want to take in 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour. That's if you're doing efforts that are longer than an hour and a half, or kind of more intense runs or workouts. I might take in carbs if I'm doing an hour of intervals, for example. And you want to take in 300 to 600 milligrams of sodium per hour. People who avoid taking sugar, and definitely people who avoid taking salt, are going to really feel that within the run, within the race, but they're also going to feel it in recovery. If you've ever had muscles that have just like seized up after a race, or you've had a massive headache the next day after a long run or something, probably because you're not taking enough sodium.
So mistake number 5 is ignoring your weight. Running obviously makes you hungry. If you're like me, you've had many runs where you've came back and just fucking ate the entire earth. It's normal. So when you're running, something called endocannabinoids are produced in the body, and these are chemicals that are very similar to the chemicals found in THC, which is found in cannabis. After a run, you essentially get the natural organic health food version of the munchies. So it's no wonder you feel hungry. The thing is, you probably overcompensate with the amount of food that you eat. I say probably, I'm speaking about myself, don't know about you, leading to weight gain or a lack of weight loss. Obviously, you don't want to be in a massive calorie deficit all the time, especially when you're training, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But the point is that even as a runner, even doing marathon training, ultra marathon training, running 100 miles a week, it's still possible. It is still possible to gain weight, and you're not guaranteed to lose weight. So you do have to be a little bit mindful. And you're probably wondering, is that actually important? Why does your weight matter? And the summary is, and this is pretty definitive, the lighter you are, the easier running becomes. Like, it's as clear cut as that. So according to Matt Fitzgerald, who's this running author, he's done loads of books, weight and body fat have a higher correlation with finishing times than any other training variable, including weekly mileage, VO2 max, anything like that. Weight and body fat are more important, and that's fucking crazy. That's absolutely wild.
So to put that correlation thing into perspective, a runner who weighs 160 pounds needs 6.5% more energy to run at the same pace as a 150 pound runner, which is just wild. If you think about that over the course of a marathon, that's crazy. So if you want to be fast, it's definitely worth thinking about your weight. Now, weight isn't the only metric that we should be thinking of. Weight itself is not actually as important as body composition. So when I say body composition, I'm essentially talking about the relationship between body fat and muscle and bone. And essentially the objective as a runner is to have as little body fat as possible and have more muscle mass essentially. Body fat requires more oxygen to exist, whereas muscle actually helps your performance. So the objective should not be to lose weight, because if you just lose weight, you might actually be losing muscle mass, which is not good. So essentially the goal is, how can you lose body fat, not necessarily how can you lose weight. So the way to do that is not to go into a massive calorie deficit, and especially not while you're training. You really while you're training, you don't want to go into a calorie deficit at all, really, because that will start to impact your performance and your recovery, which will in turn impact your race times. The best way is to go into a mild calorie deficit when you're outside of training, something like 500 calories per day. That'll make sure that you're eating enough to sustain your muscle mass, but not eating enough that you can lose weight, but doing it in a safe sort of way. While you're training, the better thing to do is to eat enough calories, but to eat good calories. So focus on whole foods, eat at the right time. So you want to eat just before a workout and just after a workout, so that the energy will get used for the immediate muscle needs instead of getting stored as fat. And there's a lot more things you can think about. This is just a brief overview. If there's interest, I could definitely do a longer video on this. Essentially, the key thing is to be mindful about not going overboard. I've definitely underate before while training, and it was one of the worst periods of my life. It was fucking horrible. I was always tired, and life was just miserable. So, yeah, don't do that.